In our last video, we explored some of the worst kings in history, rulers whose arrogance, cruelty, or incompetence dragged their nations into chaos. But the story doesn't end there. Across centuries and continents, more monarchs left behind legacies stained with disaster, corruption, and bloodshed. Some lost wars through reckless pride, some crushed their own people with brutality, and others sat idle while their empires crumbled around them. This is part 2 of the series, The Worst Kings in History, and in this chapter, we look 20 more rulers whose actions or inaction changed the course of nations. From kings who betrayed their allies, to emperors who wasted fortunes on vanity, to monarchs whose cruelty sparked uprisings and revolutions, their names are remembered not for greatness, but for ruin. Number 21. King Edward II of England, 1284 to 1327. Edward II is remembered as one of England's weakest and most disastrous monarchs. Unlike his father, Edward I, who was known as a warrior king and a capable ruler, Edward II had little interest in governance or military leadership. He was more interested in leisure activities such as rowing and carpentry, which made the nobles consider him unfit for kingship. His reign was marked by favoritism, mismanagement, and military disasters that weakened the English crown. One of Edward's most notorious flaws was his reliance on a small circle of personal favorites, particularly Piers Gaveston. Edward showered Gaveston with lands, wealth, and titles, alienating the nobility who believed that governance should be a shared responsibility. The barons saw Gaveston as arrogant and manipulative, and Edward's refusal to heed their grievances led to civil strife. The barons forced Gaveston's exile multiple times, yet Edward continually reinstated him. Eventually, the nobles captured Gaveston and executed him without royal consent, an act that further humiliated Edward and revealed his inability to control his kingdom. Militarily, Edward's reign was catastrophic. The most infamous example was the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, where the Scots, under Robert the Bruce, crushed the English army. Edward personally led his forces, but showed cowardice in battle and fled the field, leaving thousands of his soldiers to be slaughtered. This defeat secured Scotland's independence and severely damaged England's prestige. Edward's failure to defend English interests made him a laughingstock across Europe. Edward also demonstrated gross incompetence in managing the kingdom's finances. His lavish spending on favorites drained the royal treasury. Meanwhile, the common people suffered from famine and economic hardship in the early 13th century, yet Edward did little to alleviate their struggles. Instead, he imposed heavy taxes that further angered the population. His misrule culminated in civil war. The nobles, led by his wife, Queen Isabella, and her lover, Roger Mortimer, invaded England in 1326. Edward was abandoned by his supporters, captured, and forced to abdicate in favor of his young son, Edward III. His ignominious end came in 1327, when he was murdered in Berkeley Castle, allegedly with extreme brutality. Edward II's legacy is one of weakness, favoritism, and incompetence. He failed in almost every responsibility of kingship: military defense, political unity, financial stability, and moral authority. His disastrous reign is often considered a warning of what happens when personal indulgence and misplaced loyalty outweigh the duties of leadership. Number 22. King Louis XVI of France, 1754 to 1793. Louis XVI's reign represents one of the most disastrous failures in European history, as his indecision and incompetence played a central role in sparking the French Revolution and bringing down the monarchy. Though not a cruel tyrant in the traditional sense, Louis's weakness and inability to act decisively in the face of crisis doomed France and himself. When Louis ascended the throne in 1774, France was already drowning in debt. His predecessors had spent extravagantly on wars and luxury, but Louis continued the pattern by financially supporting the American Revolution against Britain. This drained French resources further without providing meaningful returns. Instead of implementing bold reforms to save the economy, Louis dithered, alternating between half-hearted reforms and reactionary policies that pleased no one. Louis's extravagance at Versailles also made him a symbol of royal excess. He and Queen Marie Antoinette lived in opulence while the French people faced food shortages and famine. Antoinette's frivolous spending earned her the nickname Madame Deficit. But Louis was equally guilty of indulging in hunting and personal hobbies while ignoring the cries of his starving subjects. Politically, he lacked the decisiveness needed to confront the crisis. When the Estates General met in 1789, Louis vacillated between granting concessions and attempting repression. His inability to choose a consistent course emboldened the revolutionaries. Instead of reforming taxation to make the nobility and clergy pay their share, he clung to outdated privileges, angering the Third Estate. His poor judgment culminated in the storming of the Bastille and the beginning of full-scale revolution. His greatest blunder came in 1791, when he attempted to flee Paris during the revolution. His escape plan, known as the Flight to Varennes, failed miserably, and he was captured. This act destroyed any remaining trust between him and the people. By abandoning the capital, he confirmed suspicions that he sought international intervention against his own subjects. His final downfall came during the French Revolutionary Wars. He was accused of conspiring with Austria and other monarchs to restore his absolute power. His trial in 1792 revealed his duplicity, and he was convicted of treason. In January 1793, he was executed by guillotine. Louis XVI is remembered not for cruelty, but for weakness, indecision, and failure to adapt. His incompetence destroyed centuries of French monarchy, plunged France into bloody revolution, and set the stage for Napoleon's rise. He stands as an example of how inaction can be as disastrous as tyranny. Number 23. King Henry VI of England, 1421 to 1471. Henry VI's reign was disastrous both for England and for the monarchy itself. Unlike strong rulers before him, Henry was weak, indecisive, and prone to mental illness, making him incapable of handling the burdens of kingship. His failures plunged England into the bloody civil conflict known as the Wars of the Roses. Henry inherited the throne as an infant, and during his minority, capable regents held the kingdom together. But once he assumed personal rule, Henry proved utterly unsuited for kingship. He was deeply pious, preferring prayer and religious study to governance. While admirable in personal life, this made him disastrously ineffective as a monarch, since he neglected the responsibilities of war, diplomacy, and justice. One of his greatest failures was losing most of England's French territories. Under his grandfather, Henry V, England had controlled large parts of France. But Henry VI's weakness and inability to command respect led to military collapse. The decisive loss at the Battle of Castillon in 1453 marked the end of the Hundred Years' War and England's expulsion from France except for Calais. This humiliated the English nobility and eroded confidence in the crown. Henry's mental instability compounded the crisis. In 1453, he suffered a mental breakdown, during which he was catatonic and incapable of ruling for over a year. During these episodes, rival noble factions battled for control, plunging the kingdom into chaos. His inability to provide strong leadership fueled resentment and encouraged powerful nobles to pursue their own ambitions. His marriage to Margaret of Anjou also proved disastrous. Margaret was politically ambitious and acted as de facto ruler during Henry's incapacity, but her assertiveness alienated many nobles. She clashed with Richard the Duke of York, sparking open conflict. The Wars of the Roses devastated England, killing thousands and destabilizing the monarchy. Henry was repeatedly deposed and restored, but never commanded loyalty. Eventually, Edward IV, son of the Duke of York, captured him. In 1471, Henry was murdered in the Tower of London, likely on Edward's orders, ending his pitiful reign. Henry VI is remembered as a weak king, whose failures caused immense bloodshed. His inability to govern effectively, his loss of France, and his role in sparking civil war destroyed the stability of England for generations.
24. Emperor Commodus of Rome, 161 to 192. Few Roman emperors are as infamous as Commodus, whose reign marked the beginning of the decline of the Roman Empire. The son of Marcus Aurelius, one of Rome's greatest emperors, Commodus squandered his inheritance through vanity, cruelty, and neglect of governance. From the beginning, Commodus was more interested in luxury and personal amusement than ruling. He left much of the administration to corrupt favorites and freedmen, who exploited their positions to enrich themselves while neglecting the empire. Bribery, extortion, and incompetence flourished under his rule. Commodus himself indulged in bizarre behavior. He fancied himself the reincarnation of Hercules, dressing in lion skins and carrying a club. He even renamed Rome Colonia Commodina after himself, forcing people to worship him as a living god. Such vanity shocked Romans, who were accustomed to emperors displaying at least some humility in public life. His obsession with gladiatorial combat was another disgrace. Commodus frequently appeared in the arena fighting as a gladiator against helpless opponents. Although he claimed thousands of victories, these matches were staged and opponents were often crippled or armed with wooden weapons. He humiliated the Senate by forcing senators to watch him perform, undermining the dignity of the empire. Politically, his neglect led to widespread instability. Military commanders were alienated, and plots against him multiplied. Commodus responded with paranoia and cruelty, ordering executions of perceived enemies. His reign of terror created fear among nobles, but further weakened loyalty. Eventually, his bizarre behavior became intolerable even to his inner circle. In 192, a conspiracy of officials and his mistress had him strangled. His death ended the Nerva Antonine dynasty and plunged Rome into civil war known as the Year of the Five Emperors. Commodus is remembered as a vain, cruel, and incompetent ruler who turned the dignity of the Roman Empire into a personal circus. His reign marked the transition from Rome's golden age to centuries of decline. 25. King Philip III of Spain, 1578 to 1621. Philip III's reign is considered one of the weakest in Spanish history, a time when Spain's global power began to crumble. Unlike his father, Philip II, who personally managed the Spanish Empire, Philip III was lazy and uninterested in governance, preferring leisure and religious devotion to ruling effectively. Philip delegated most of his power to his favorite, the Duke of Lerma, whose corruption and greed drained the Spanish treasury. Lerma enriched himself and his allies through bribes and the sale of offices while neglecting the empire's pressing problems. Spain faced mounting debt, inflation, and military overstretch, but little was done to address these issues. One of Philip's most infamous decisions was the expulsion of the Moriscos in 1609. The Moriscos, descendants of Muslims who had converted to Christianity, were accused of secretly practicing Islam. Philip ordered their mass expulsion, uprooting hundreds of thousands of people who contributed significantly to Spain's economy, especially in agriculture. This act weakened Spain's labor force, reduced tax revenues, and damaged its economy for decades. In foreign policy, Philip III continued costly wars against the Dutch and other European powers without achieving significant gains. His neglect of naval power allowed Spain's maritime supremacy to fade. Meanwhile, rival powers like England and the Netherlands grew stronger at Spain's expense. Domestically, Philip's court became notorious for extravagance and waste. While the treasury emptied, the king indulged in lavish entertainments and religious ceremonies. The people bore the burden of high taxes and inflation, leading to widespread discontent. Philip's personal passivity was his greatest flaw. He avoided decision-making and allowed Lerma to rule in his name for nearly 2 decades. Only later, when Lerma was disgraced, did Philip attempt to reassert control. But by then, Spain's decline was evident. Philip III's reign represents the failure of monarchy through neglect. His laziness, reliance on corrupt favorites, and disastrous decisions like the expulsion of the Moriscos weakened Spain irreversibly. He's remembered not for cruelty, but for incompetence and for presiding over the slow collapse of Spain's once mighty empire.
26. King James II of England, 1633 to 1701. James II is remembered as one of England's most disastrous monarchs, not because he was cruel in the mold of tyrants, but because his stubbornness, religious intolerance, and disregard for constitutional principles triggered a revolution that ended his reign. His failures were political and ideological, rooted in his inability to recognize the mood of his kingdom. From the start, James's open Catholicism was a problem. England was a Protestant nation, and while private Catholic sympathies among the nobility were tolerated, James openly practiced his faith and promoted Catholic interests. As king, he appointed Catholics to positions of power in government, the military, and universities, directly challenging laws designed to preserve Protestant dominance. This created widespread resentment and fear that he intended to restore Catholic absolutism. His authoritarian tendencies deepened the crisis. James ignored Parliament when it opposed his policies, ruling instead by royal decree. He suspended laws at will, particularly those restricting Catholic participation in public life, setting a dangerous precedent. His belief in divine right clashed with England's evolving constitutional framework, where Parliament was gaining power. James also mishandled the army. He created a standing force loyal to him personally, placing Catholic officers in command. This alarmed both Protestants and traditional nobles, who feared a permanent Catholic military dictatorship. Perhaps his greatest blunder was the Declaration of Indulgence in 1687, which granted religious freedom not only to Catholics but also to Protestant dissenters. While on the surface this seemed progressive, many saw it as a cynical move to undermine the Church of England and increase Catholic influence. James compounded the mistake by demanding that clergy read the declaration from their pulpits, sparking outrage among Anglican bishops. The final straw was the birth of his son in 1688, which raised the prospect of a permanent Catholic dynasty. Until then, many had tolerated James, hoping his Protestant daughter Mary would succeed him. But the new heir shattered that hope. A group of nobles invited Mary's husband, William of Orange, to invade. When William landed, James found himself deserted by his army and allies. He fled to France, effectively abdicating. James spent the rest of his life in exile, plotting to regain the throne, but failing in attempts like the Jacobite uprisings. His reign was remembered as a cautionary tale of arrogance, religious favoritism, and disregard for the nation's values. By clinging stubbornly to Catholic absolutism, he destroyed his own dynasty and ensured that Parliament supremacy would define English politics thereafter. 27. King Charles VI of France, 1368 to 1422. King Charles VI of France, often called Charles the Mad, was one of the most disastrous monarchs in French history. His reign combined personal mental illness with political incompetence, plunging France into chaos during the 100 Years' War. At first, Charles showed promise. Early in his reign, he was nicknamed Charles the Well-Beloved.
But in 1392, he suffered his first bout of madness, attacking his own companions in a paranoid frenzy. From then on, his episodes grew worse, leaving him catatonic or delusional for long periods. Sometimes he forgot he was king or believed he was made of glass. These incapacities left France without effective leadership. His illness created a power vacuum exploited by rival factions. The Dukes of Burgundy and Orleans vied for control of the government, turning the kingdom into a battleground for their personal ambitions. The Burgundians eventually orchestrated the assassination of Louis of Orleans in 1407, escalating the Civil War. Instead of uniting against England, France was consumed by internal strife. Charles's inability to rule also weakened France militarily. The English took advantage of the chaos, winning crushing victories such as Agincourt in 1415. French forces were humiliated and the country descended into despair. One of the worst consequences of Charles's reign was the Treaty of Troyes in 1420. With Charles incapacitated, his wife Queen Isabel and the Burgundians agreed to disinherit the Dauphin, the future Charles VII, and recognize England's Henry V as heir to the French throne. This humiliating agreement nearly destroyed French sovereignty, effectively handing the kingdom to a foreign power. Domestically, Charles's illness led to corruption and mismanagement. His court was notorious for extravagance, while the population suffered from war, famine, and taxation. Queen Isabel was accused of adultery and greed, further tarnishing the monarchy's reputation. By the time Charles died in 1422, France was divided, impoverished, and partially occupied by the English. His reign was remembered as one of incompetence and tragedy. Though his madness was not his fault, his inability to govern and the chaos it caused made him one of history's worst kings.
28. King Henry VIII of England, 1491 to 1547. Henry VIII is infamous not only for his 6 marriages, but for his tyranny, cruelty, and destructive policies. Though he strengthened the monarchy in some ways, his legacy is overshadowed by bloodshed, religious upheaval, and personal excess. Henry's obsession with producing a male heir drove much of his misrule. When the Pope refused to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, Henry broke with Rome and declared himself head of the Church of England. This act, driven by personal desire rather than reformist zeal, plunged England into decades of religious turmoil. Monasteries were dissolved, their wealth seized, and traditional Catholic practices suppressed. The dissolution destroyed centuries of cultural and charitable institutions, enriching Henry while leaving the poor without support. His marital history is equally notorious. Henry divorced or executed wives in his desperate quest for a son. Anne Boleyn was executed on trumped-up charges of adultery and incest. Jane Seymour died after childbirth. Anne of Cleves was discarded, and Catherine Howard was executed for alleged infidelity. These brutal acts revealed Henry's cruelty and volatility. Politically, Henry ruled through fear. He used charges of treason and heresy to eliminate opponents, often on flimsy evidence. Prominent figures like Thomas More and Thomas Cromwell were executed for failing to please him. His paranoia created an atmosphere of terror in court. Economically, Henry squandered the wealth he gained from the monasteries on wars and personal extravagance. His military campaigns in France were costly and largely unsuccessful, draining the treasury. Inflation soared, and ordinary people bore the burden through taxation. Henry also grew increasingly tyrannical in his later years. Obese, paranoid, and cruel, he executed even close friends and family members. His reign left England religiously divided, financially weakened, and politically unstable. Though he centralized royal authority, Henry VIII's reign is remembered more for blood and chaos than achievement. His cruelty, religious destruction, and selfishness make him one of England's worst monarchs. 29. King Antiochus IV Epiphanes of the Seleucid Empire. Antiochus IV Epiphanes of the Seleucid Empire is remembered as a tyrant whose oppressive policies provoked the Maccabean revolt and destabilized his kingdom. Though he considered himself a divine ruler, history remembers him for cruelty, arrogance, and disastrous religious intolerance. Antiochus came to power in 175 BC and quickly adopted the title Epiphanes, meaning God manifest. His subjects, however, nicknamed him Epimanes, or the madman, due to his erratic and eccentric behavior. He demanded worship as a living god, shocking both Greeks and Jews under his rule. One of his most infamous acts was his harsh suppression of Jewish religious practices. In an attempt to Hellenize his subjects, Antiochus banned circumcision, Sabbath observance, and Jewish dietary laws. He desecrated the Jewish temple in Jerusalem by installing an altar to Zeus and sacrificing pigs there, an unthinkable blasphemy to the Jewish people. His persecution was brutal, with executions, forced conversions, and the destruction of sacred texts. These actions provoked the Maccabean Revolt, a Jewish uprising that challenged Seleucid rule. The revolt drained resources and exposed Antiochus's weakness as he failed to suppress it effectively. Instead of consolidating his empire, he fractured it through intolerance. Antiochus also pursued reckless military campaigns. He attempted to expand into Egypt, but was forced to withdraw when Rome intervened, humiliating him. His ambitions outstripped his capabilities, leaving his empire weakened. His reign ended in failure. Antiochus died during a campaign in Persia, leaving behind a fractured and unstable empire. His policies not only alienated his subjects, but also destroyed the Seleucid dynasty's authority in Judea. Antiochus IV is remembered as arrogant, intolerant, and destructive. His cruelty and religious persecution made him a hated figure in history, and his misrule weakened one of the great Hellenistic empires.
30. King Charles of England, 1600 to 1649. Charles I's reign ended in civil war and his execution, making him one of England's most notorious monarchs. His stubborn belief in absolute monarchy, disregard for Parliament, and failure to compromise plunged the kingdom into chaos. From the beginning, Charles clashed with Parliament over money and power. He believed in the divine right of kings and ruled without Parliament for 11 years, raising money through unpopular taxes such as ship money. This autocratic style alienated his subjects, who saw him as trampling on their rights. Religiously, Charles provoked anger by supporting Archbishop Laud's reforms, which many believed resembled Catholic practices. His marriage to a Catholic queen, Henrietta Maria of France, fueled suspicions that he sought to restore Catholicism. These fears turned much of Protestant England against him. When Parliament resisted his demands, Charles resorted to arresting opponents and dissolving sessions. His inflexibility destroyed trust and made compromise impossible. Eventually, tensions erupted in the English Civil War in 1642. Charles proved an incompetent war leader. His forces were poorly managed, and his failure to secure consistent victories doomed his cause. Meanwhile, the parliamentarians under Oliver Cromwell grew stronger. Even after capture, Charles's arrogance prevented resolution. He conspired with the Scots to reignite conflict, showing bad faith. This led to renewed bloodshed in the Second Civil War. In 1649, Charles was tried and convicted of treason against his people. He was executed, the first English monarch to suffer such a fate. His death shocked Europe and marked a turning point in limiting royal power. Charles is remembered as stubborn, arrogant, and disastrously inflexible. By refusing compromise, he destroyed his own monarchy and caused a bloody civil war that scarred England for generations.
31. King George III of England, 1738 to 1820. George III's reign is one of the most infamous in British history, remembered above all for the loss of the American colonies and for his debilitating mental illness that left the kingdom leaderless during crucial years. While he was not deliberately cruel, his stubbornness, short-sightedness, and inability to adapt to change led to disasters that reshaped the world. From the outset, George was determined to be a moral and active king, unlike his Hanoverian predecessors. But his sense of duty quickly became stubborn interference in government. He frequently dismissed ministers, imposed his will on Parliament, and tried to control policy far more than was advisable. His insistence on absolute authority clashed with the growing spirit of parliamentary governance. His handling of the American colonies is the clearest example of his failings. After Britain's victory in the 7 Years' War, the government sought to tax the colonies to pay for defense. George supported measures like the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts, believing strongly in Parliament's right to tax the colonies. When protests erupted, he backed harsher enforcement rather than compromise. His refusal to consider colonial grievances turned discontent into outright rebellion. During the American Revolutionary War, George demanded total victory, rejecting conciliatory proposals. Even as the war turned against Britain, he insisted on continuing until the humiliating defeat at Yorktown in 1781. His stubbornness wasted lives, resources, and ultimately resulted in Britain losing its most valuable colonies. George's reign was also marred by his mental illness, now thought to be either bipolar disorder or porphyria. He suffered prolonged episodes of madness during which he babbled incoherently, shouted uncontrollably, or could not recognize those around him. These breakdowns left Britain without effective leadership at critical times, including during the Napoleonic Wars. For much of the latter part of his reign, his son ruled as Prince Regent. Although George was personally frugal and devout, his inability to delegate power effectively and his insistence on controlling politics made his reign unstable. His failures in America cost Britain global dominance, and his madness left the monarchy in chaos. George III is remembered as a well-meaning but disastrously stubborn and ineffective king. His failures altered world history, proving how personal rigidity at the top can change the fate of nations. 32. Emperor Maximilian of Mexico, 1832 to 1867. Maximilian's reign as Emperor of Mexico was short, disastrous, and tragic. Installed by French Emperor Napoleon III in 1864, Maximilian was an outsider with little understanding of Mexico's politics or culture. His inability to secure legitimacy and his naive idealism ensured his reign ended in blood. Maximilian, an Austrian archduke, accepted the throne believing he could bring progress and stability. But his empire was built on foreign bayonets. French troops had invaded Mexico after the country defaulted on European debts, and Napoleon III saw an opportunity to establish a puppet regime. Mexican conservatives supported the plan, hoping Maximilian would restore traditional privileges. From the start, Maximilian was doomed. Most Mexicans supported the Republican forces of Benito Juárez, who resisted foreign intervention. Maximilian tried to present himself as a reformer, introducing laws to protect peasants and limit forced labor. Ironically, these liberal policies alienated the conservative elites who had invited him in the first place. His biggest weakness was his reliance on French support. When Napoleon III withdrew troops in 1866 under U.S. pressure, Maximilian was left exposed. Lacking a strong army or popular support, he faced inevitable defeat. Instead of fleeing, Maximilian chose to stay, claiming he would not abandon his people. This decision, more romantic than rational, sealed his fate. Republican forces captured him in 1867. Despite pleas for mercy from European monarchs, he was executed by firing squad, becoming a symbol of foreign folly. Maximilian's reign was disastrous because it was illegitimate from the start. He was a foreign ruler imposed on a proud and independent nation. His failure to understand Mexican politics, his dependence on French arms, and his naive decisions made him an object of ridicule. Though personally cultured and well-meaning, history remembers him as a weak and deluded puppet whose reign ended in catastrophe.
33. King John II of France, 1319 to 1364. John II of France, known as John the Good, is remembered ironically, as his reign was marked by military defeats, financial ruin, and personal incompetence. His failures during the Hundred Years' War deepened France's suffering and humiliation. John inherited a difficult situation, but his leadership worsened it. Militarily, he was reckless and poorly prepared. The defining disaster of his reign was the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, where the English army, under the Black Prince, crushed the French. John himself was captured, an unprecedented humiliation for a king. His capture threw France into chaos, with his son Charles forced to govern as regent while the English demanded massive ransoms. To secure his release, John agreed to the Treaty of Bretigny in 1360, which ceded vast French territories to England and required an enormous ransom. The cost crippled the French economy, forcing crushing taxes on the population. Resentment boiled over in revolts such as the Jacquerie, a peasant uprising brutally suppressed but never forgotten. John's personal character worsened matters. He indulged in luxury and extravagance even while his kingdom bled. His poor judgment was evident when he voluntarily returned to English captivity in 1364 after one of his sons, held as a hostage, escaped. While this act might be seen as honorable, it was politically idiotic, leaving France leaderless again. He died in London that same year, leaving his kingdom weakened and humiliated. His reign represents one of the lowest points in French history, remembered for defeat, humiliation, and poor leadership. Despite his nickname, John II was anything but good. 34. King Louis XVIII of France, 1755 to 1824. Louis XVIII, restored to the throne after Napoleon's defeat, is remembered as weak, indecisive, and reactionary. His reign highlighted the inability of the Bourbon monarchy to adapt to modern political realities, paving the way for its ultimate downfall. Louis spent years in exile during the Revolution and Napoleonic Wars. When restored in 1814, he faced a divided nation: royalists who wanted to restore absolute monarchy, liberals who wanted constitutional freedoms, and Bonapartists loyal to Napoleon. Louis tried to balance these factions but pleased none. He agreed to a constitutional charter that limited royal power, but he undermined it whenever possible, restoring privileges to the nobility and clergy. His government became a battleground between reactionary ministers and moderates, creating instability. His biggest humiliation came in 1815 during the 100 Days. When Napoleon escaped exile and marched on Paris, Louis fled without resistance. Napoleon regained power effortlessly, while Louis appeared cowardly and weak. Only Napoleon's final defeat at Waterloo allowed him to return. Louis's court was notorious for corruption, nepotism, and waste. He relied heavily on his brother, the future Charles X, whose ultra-conservative policies alienated the population. Meanwhile, Louis himself grew obese and inactive, uninterested in governance. By the time of his death in 1824, Louis had failed to reconcile France's divisions. His reign exposed the fragility of Bourbon rule and set the stage for further turmoil. He is remembered as a weak monarch who returned France to reaction without providing stability or progress.
35. King Afonso V of Portugal, 1432 to 1481. Afonso V of Portugal, nicknamed the African, is remembered as one of Portugal's least effective monarchs. Though he sought glory through military campaigns, his neglect of domestic reform and reckless wars weakened his kingdom. Afonso focused much of his reign on North Africa, launching costly expeditions to conquer Muslim territories. While he achieved some victories, such as the capture of Alcácer Seguer, these campaigns drained Portugal's resources without providing lasting benefits. his obsession with African conquests distracted him from pressing issues at home. He also embroiled Portugal in dynastic wars in Castile. After the death of Castile's king, Afonso married his niece, Joanna, and invaded Castile to claim the throne. The campaign was disastrous, culminating in defeat at the Battle of Toro in 1476. Though the battle was technically indecisive, politically it ruined Afonso's ambitions. Domestically, Afonso failed to curb noble power or implement reforms. Instead, he relied on aristocratic support for his military adventures, giving them greater influence at the expense of royal authority. The economy stagnated under heavy taxation, and the population suffered from neglect. In his later years, Afonso even abdicated temporarily in favor of his son, John II, showing his exhaustion and lack of will to govern. He eventually resumed the throne, but accomplished little thereafter. Afonso's reign is remembered as a period of wasted opportunities. While Portugal's explorers began their journeys along the African coast, Afonso himself focused on costly wars that drained the kingdom. His legacy is one of overreach, incompetence, and failure to strengthen Portugal at a crucial moment in its history. 36. Emperor Valentinian III of Rome, 419 to 455. Valentinian III's reign represents the tragic collapse of the Western Roman Empire into chaos, corruption, and foreign domination. He ascended to the throne as a child, manipulated by his ambitious mother, Galla Placidia, and powerful generals. Unfortunately, when he reached adulthood, Valentinian proved utterly incapable of leadership. One of his greatest failings was his reliance on corrupt and incompetent advisors. Rather than governing wisely, he spent his reign indulging in luxury, idleness, and petty intrigues. While Rome's enemies grew stronger, Valentinian wasted precious years on palace politics. He became dependent on generals such as Flavius Aetius, the only competent commander who kept the empire afloat. Valentinian's cowardice and paranoia sealed his ruin. In 454, in an act of treachery, he personally murdered Aetius, stabbing him during a meeting. This reckless act destroyed the empire's last hope of military stability. With Aetius dead, Rome was defenseless against barbarian invasions. The consequences came swiftly. In 455, the Vandals, under King Genseric, sacked Rome, looting the city for 2 weeks. This disaster symbolized the empire's helplessness, and it occurred under Valentinian's watch. His inability to lead, compounded by his betrayal of Aetius, directly caused this humiliation. Valentinian himself met a violent end. Shortly after Aetius's murder, he was assassinated by loyalists of the slain general. His reign is remembered as a time of cowardice, incompetence, and betrayal, marking one of the final nails in the coffin of the Western Roman Empire. 37. Peter III of Russia, 1728 to 1762. Peter III of Russia, though he reigned for only 6 months, managed to alienate nearly every segment of Russian society. His incompetence, reckless decisions, and obsession with Prussia made him one of Russia's most despised rulers. Peter was born in Germany and never fully embraced Russian culture. He struggled with the Russian language and showed disdain for local traditions, making him appear as a foreigner ruling an unwilling people. His obsession with all things German made him deeply unpopular among nobles and the military. One of his most notorious acts was ending Russia's participation in the 7 Years' War. Despite Russia being on the verge of victory over Prussia, Peter, an admirer of Frederick the Great,
immediately reversed alliances and made peace. He even offered Prussia territory Russia had gained during the war. This betrayal infuriated the army, which had sacrificed so much during the war. Domestically, Peter pursued reforms that alienated nearly everyone. He offended the powerful Orthodox Church by seizing church property. He angered nobles by planning to free serfs who worked on their estates, while simultaneously alienating peasants by favoring German officers and policies. Peter's personal behavior was equally disgraceful. He was described as childish, immature, and more interested in playing with toy soldiers than governing. His cruelty and drunken outbursts alienated his wife, the future Catherine the Great, who plotted against him.
38. Umberto of Italy, 1844 to 1900. King Umberto of Italy is remembered as a reactionary monarch whose policies and indifference to suffering earned him the nickname the King of the Slaughter. His reign, 1878 to 1900, highlighted the deep divisions and instability of newly unified Italy. Umberto came to power determined to strengthen the monarchy and suppress dissent. Unfortunately, he pursued authoritarian policies that alienated the working class and fueled unrest. Strikes and protests were frequent in late 19th century Italy, driven by poverty and inequality. Instead of addressing grievances, Umberto relied on violent repression. The worst example was the Bava Beccaris massacre in Milan in 1898. When protests broke out over bread shortages, General Bava Beccaris ordered troops to fire on demonstrators, killing hundreds. Rather than condemning the brutality, Umberto praised the general and awarded him honors. This callousness made him a symbol of royal indifference to the suffering of ordinary Italians. Umberto also supported costly colonial adventures in Africa, which ended in disaster. The humiliating defeat at the Battle of Adwa in 1896, where Ethiopian forces crushed the Italian army, exposed the weakness of Italy's ambitions and deepened resentment at home. His political style was rigid and outdated. He refused to consider reforms or compromise with liberal forces, relying instead on military power and conservative elites. This created an atmosphere of repression and discontent that fueled revolutionary movements. In 1900, Umberto's arrogance cost him his life. An anarchist, Gaetano Bresci, assassinated him in Monza as revenge for the massacre in Milan. His death symbolized the anger he inspired among the oppressed. Umberto's legacy is one of repression, incompetence, and cruelty. Instead of guiding Italy through its early years of unity, he deepened divisions and left behind a legacy of bloodshed. 39. King Otho of Greece, 1815 to 1867. Otho of Greece, the first modern king of an independent Greece, is remembered as a foreign monarch who never understood his people and whose incompetence nearly destroyed the fragile new state. A Bavarian prince, Otho was chosen as king in 1832, after the Greek War of Independence. But instead of embracing Greek culture, he surrounded himself with Bavarian advisors and imposed foreign customs, alienating the very people he was supposed to rule. He even refused to convert from Catholicism to Orthodoxy, further straining relations with his subjects. Otho ruled as an absolute monarch at first, ignoring demands for a constitution. His government was dominated by corruption and inefficiency. Public offices were handed out to foreigners or cronies, while Greek leaders who had fought for independence were sidelined. The economy stagnated under his rule. Heavy taxation and mismanagement left the population impoverished, while Otho wasted money on palaces and luxuries.
His lack of understanding of Greek society bred resentment. When pressured into granting a constitution in 1844, Otho still clung to power, undermining democratic institutions. He remained disconnected from political realities and never gained true legitimacy. His greatest failure was his inability to produce an heir with his wife, Queen Amelia. This created instability, as Greeks feared the throne would pass back to foreign hands. His attempts at expansion, including meddling in conflicts with the Ottoman Empire, were reckless and failed to achieve results. By 1862, popular anger boiled over. Otho was overthrown in a military revolt and forced into exile. He lived the rest of his life in obscurity in Bavaria. Otho's reign is remembered as a period of disappointment. He was a foreigner who never earned the trust of his people, squandered resources, and failed to establish stability in a new nation. His incompetence and arrogance made him one of Greece's most unpopular monarchs. 40. Nicholas II of Russia, 1868 to 1918. Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia, is one of history's most infamous monarchs. His reign was marked by arrogance, incompetence, and failure to address the massive challenges facing his empire. His actions and inaction led directly to revolution, civil war, and the destruction of the Romanov dynasty. From the beginning, Nicholas was ill-prepared for rule. He admitted himself that he never wanted to be Tsar and had little understanding of government. Yet he clung stubbornly to absolute power, refusing to allow meaningful reforms. One of his earliest disasters was the Russo-Japanese War, 1904 to 1905. Believing Russia could easily defeat Japan, Nicholas launched the conflict to expand influence in Asia. Instead, Russia suffered humiliating defeats, including the destruction of its navy. The war revealed the incompetence of Russia's leadership and fueled domestic unrest. The anger exploded in the 1905 revolution, when peaceful protesters marching in St. Petersburg were massacred by soldiers in the event known as Bloody Sunday. Nicholas's refusal to accept responsibility shattered his image as the little father of the people. Though he granted a constitution and parliament, the Duma, he quickly undermined them, proving he had no intention of sharing power. His greatest failure came during World War I. Nicholas took personal command of the army in 1915, despite having no military expertise. Russian forces suffered catastrophic losses, while food shortages and economic collapse devastated the home front. His absence from the capital allowed his wife Alexandra and the mystic Rasputin to dominate politics, fueling scandal and destroying public trust. By 1917, anger boiled over in the February Revolution. Nicholas was forced to abdicate, ending 300 years of Romanov rule. His attempt to cling to absolute power in the face of modern challenges destroyed the monarchy. Nicholas and his family were executed by the Bolsheviks in 1918. His reign is remembered as a tragic failure. A weak, stubborn ruler who failed his people, caused immense suffering, and paved the way for one of the most violent revolutions in history.